tracks circled the entire compound. They were very close.
And a large pack. They headed north, towards the mountains.
High on the wind-scraped terraces of the Afghan highlands, where winter lays its weight across the land until even the goats walk with quiet steps, life in the Hazara village followed a rhythm older than memory. The mud homes clung to the mountainside as if built from the mountain's own bones, their thick walls and wooden beams holding back the cold that prowled through every gap. In one of these homes, where smoke curled from the chimney and a row of goat bells hung like small silver moons near the door, Karim and his family, the mother Fatima, the elder Baba Zahir, and the children Nasir, Maryam, and little Sami kept to their winter routine with the care of people who knew that routine was the difference between safety and sorrow. The snow had been steady, not like the blizzard that trapped them earlier in the season, but persistent enough to turn the valley into a pale ocean where every sound traveled far and every shape seemed to move at the corner of the eye. The goats were leaner than usual, and their hooves clicked on ice with a sound like pottery tapping together, yet they still gave enough milk to stretch a pot of tea and thicken a stew. Every evening, Nasir checked the woven fence around the pen, running his fingers along each stake, testing the lashings, stamping down the ice that formed at the threshold so the door would close cleanly. He did this not because he expected trouble that night, but because trouble in the mountains arrives first as a feeling, and the feeling had begun to breathe at the edges of the village like wind tasting a door. The tracks appeared first. They were not fresh enough to be alarming, but they were close enough to be remembered. Clean pads pressed lightly into the powder near the line of poplar trees above the field wall, a straight, purposeful path that swerved for nothing. The men of the village gathered to look, and said little, because there was little to say. Wolves had been ranging the ridges since the deep freeze. Rabbits had tunneled far below the snow, and the sheep in the far hamlets were guarded day and night. Wolves were part of winter, as honest and hungry as the cold itself. Some years they watched from the high places and moved on. Other years they tested fences and patience with the intelligence of creatures that had survived this land as long as anyone could remember. This year smelled like scarcity, the kind that teaches boldness. When the men walked back to their homes, each of them carried the picture of those prints in his mind, and each of them tightened something that had already been tightened the night before. Karim prepared the goat pen as he had done his entire life, but with a care that made the children watch him in silence. He dragged thick logs to reinforce the base of the fence and packed the gaps with frozen mud. He set a line of flat stones along the inside perimeter so the goats could not burrow the straw outward and create a foothold. He checked the hinge of the door twice, and then a third time, and when he finished, he sent Nasir to fetch a handful of the bells from inside. The boy returned with them, cradled against his coat, the metal cool and bright. Together, they strung 3 at different heights inside the penlow, mid and near the top beam so that any shove, leap, or hard paw at the fence would sing a warning. Fatima watched from the doorway, her shawl pulled tight over her hair, and when Karim finished, he met her eyes and gave a small nod that said, "We have done what we can for today." Night came down steadily, without drama, and the valley went to its usual hush. In the home, the family ate a careful meal, lentils thick with onions, and a sliver of goat butter, the kind of food that warms the stomach and paces the hunger rather than erasing it. Baba Zahir sat close to the hearth and ran a whetstone along the edge of an old shepherdess knife, slow and even, as if the sound alone could keep the darkness respectful. Maryam braided a fraying rope and told Sami a soft story about kids born in spring with ears like soft leaves. Outside, the air was so still it seemed to be holding its breath. Sometime after midnight, the goats began to shift and murmur in that uneasy way that wakes a shepherd in his bones. Karim was already alert when the first bell chimed a faint, bright ring that would have sounded cheerful at a festival and sounded like a snapped thread in winter. He rose and reached for his coat. Nasir rose with him because boys in these mountains do not ask to be brave. They become brave while fastening their boots. The yard was a white sheet, and their footsteps sank quietly into it. The pen sat in a pocket of shadow. The goats clustered together with their breath, making small clouds. Another bell ticked, as if touched by the wind, but no wind moved. Karim could feel the night looking back at him. He walked the fence with his gloved hand on the top beam, pausing to listen at each corner. the way you listen for your own name in a crowd. Something passed along the slope beyond the wall, with the liquid silence of a predator sliding through snow. He did not see it, but he felt the movement the way you feel a thought before it forms into words. The goats stamped and hushed. The bells went still. After a long minute, the pressure in the air lifted and the cold felt like ordinary cold again. Karim and Nasir stood there until their legs began to ache. Then they returned to the house and slid the bar gently behind them, and the whole family exhaled the breath they had unknowingly held. Morning revealed the story of the night in a line the color of ash, a trail that curved above the pen, crossed the terrace, and vanished into the bleached trunks of the poplar grove. The prints were crisp, not hurried. One set led and another followed at a distance, as if the second set were measuring the courage of the first. The village read those signs the way they read the sky. The wolves were not only passing through, they were studying the place that held meat and shelter. When the men returned from their small council, the plan was simple and as old as the ridge itself. By day, each family would keep its animals close to the walls. By afternoon, the children would bring brush and deadfall to build a ring of thorny branches around the outside of the goat's fence. At night, pairs of men would walk slow loops through the lanes and around the pens, not with the foolish idea of hunting wolves in their own darkness, but with the steadiness that tells a wild mind, not here, not now, not easy. All through that day, Fatima worked with the pace of weather. She mended the seam of a coarse sack for grain, skimmed the cooled layer from a pot of yogurt to save for the evening's bread, and checked the goat's hooves for cracks where ice could bite. Mariam helped her with the easy, dignified competence that worry makes precise, keeping Sami close by with small tasks that made him feel important. Nasir carried thorn boughs until his arms burned and then carried more. Karim set a short post outside the pen's door, drove it deep, and tied a rope around it to hold the latch down, even if a heavy body slammed the wood. Then he placed 2 oil-soaked rags in a clay bowl near the threshold, where they could be lit quickly to throw a sudden wall of fire if needed. It was good work, and it made the hours hold steady. The second night came with a wind that curled along the ridge and whispered through the cracks between stones. The moon stayed hidden, and the dark was thick enough to feel against the skin. The first sign was not a bell, but a silence. The goats froze so completely that their stillness made a sound of its own. Then the lower bell trembled, once, as if a whisker had touched it. Karim lifted his torch, its light jumping over the fence in shreds. 2 eyes burned out of the darkness from beyond the terrace wall. Level and Duna Frith, and a low shape moved with the certainty of a creature that understood wood, rope, hunger, and hesitation. Another pair of eyes appeared to the left, set wider apart, watching not the goats but the man with the fire. The torchlight made a fragile island in a black sea. Karim felt the old instinct to shout and throw, but he knew that noise at the wrong moment is like stepping into deep snow without a staff. Instead, he walked slowly toward the wall, stopped with the flame lifted at shoulder height, and let the heat spill forward, the way a shepherd lets a dog read his stance. Nasir stood a little behind him with an oiled rag and a small clay pot ready to bloom into fire if his father called. The first wolfed the closer, one lowered its head, and studied the gaps. It tested a stone, pushed its shoulder against the wall, and seemed to calculate the height of the beam. The second wolf adjusted its position to cover the first, as if they were moving pieces on a board they had played for years. They were not reckless, and they were not brave. They were simply hungry in the way of the season, and hunger makes geometry of fences. Karim took one slow step forward, and the torch hissed in the snow, the flame running brighter for a moment before settling. The nearer wolf lifted one paw and set it down again, not in fear, but in patience. Then, as if obeying a signal carried along nerves and air, both of them withdrew in a long, light glide that erased their bodies into the slope, leaving only the memory of their eyes. The goats sagged and breathed. The bells hung quiet. Karim and Nasir stood until the torch burned low, and when they returned inside, Baba Zahir let out a breath that sounded like a winter door easing open. In the morning, tracks told a larger story. There had been 4 wolves in the night, not Tutu near the wall one, circling behind the poplars, where it could test for movement at the home Isabake window, and another that had waited farther up the ridge, as if rehearsing the aftermath of success. The men gathered again, and agreed that the wolves would not give up after so respectful a conversation. They would return in daylight, not to attack, but to measure. The village tightened its belt a notch, and moved the routines inward. The goats grazed only at the edges of the yard, beneath eyes that did not blink. The children carried water 2 at a time instead of 3, keeping one hand free to grab the door. Fatima heated stones and set them under a wool blanket to make a sleeping place for Sami by the hearth, so he would not wake and wander. The day settled into a taut quiet, and even the crows seemed to speak in shorter sentences.